For centuries, humanity was seen as weak and insignificant, ignored by the galaxy, dismissed by those in power, tolerated only because it was easier than removing them. To the Galactic Council, humans were a young species that spoke far too confidently for its age. They questioned traditions older than their recorded history. They challenged laws they hadn't written. They warned about dangers no one else believed were real. That made them annoying. But annoyance was not danger. Human fleets were small. Human technology was clever, not refined. Human politics were chaotic and openly self-critical. Compared to civilizations that measured history in tens of thousands of years, humanity looked unfinished. Too divided. Too emotional. Too impatient. Council analysts labeled them reactive. Strategists labeled them containable. Archivists quietly placed them in the category reserved for species that would either assimilate or collapse. Humanity was expected to learn its place. Yet humans kept issuing warnings. They warned about unstable regions of space the Council insisted were safe. They warned about emergent behaviors in artificial intelligence networks. They warned about predatory expansion patterns forming beyond mapped borders. Every warning was detailed. Every warning was supported by data. Every warning was inconvenient. And so every warning was dismissed. The Council had seen panic before. Young species always mistook anomalies for threats. They lacked the patience to understand that the galaxy had always been dangerous, and always would be. Ancient powers had survived worse than theoretical projections and sensor noise. When humanity requested emergency hearings, they were postponed. When they demanded resource allocation for preventative defense, they were denied. When they insisted that certain trends pointed toward extinction-level danger, they were reminded, politely, that fear was not evidence. The unspoken belief was simple. If the threat were real, older civilizations would have noticed first. Humanity, meanwhile, did not shout. They documented. They modeled. They tested assumptions no one else bothered to question. They noticed patterns where others saw coincidence. They understood cascading failure because they had lived through it, on their homeworld, in their early spacefaring years, in every system that collapsed before anyone thought it could. Humans knew what slow disasters looked like. And that frightened the Council more than the warnings themselves. Because humanity wasn't asking for power. They weren't demanding control. They were asking others to prepare. Preparation implied doubt. Doubt threatened stability. Stability was the Council's greatest illusion. So humanity's reports were archived. Their projections labeled speculative. Their recommendations deemed unnecessary. The Council dismissed humanity's warning not because it was wrong, but because accepting it would have meant admitting that control was fragile, that ancient systems could fail, and that the galaxy was not as safe as it pretended to be. Humanity was told to stop worrying, to trust the system, to wait. And humanity did wait. Not because they believed the Council, but because they knew what came next when warnings were ignored. They had seen it before, many times, in many forms. And when the galaxy finally realized that humanity had been right all along, it would understand the true cost of dismissal. Because the most dangerous mistake the Council ever made wasn't underestimating humanity's strength. It was ignoring humanity's experience. And by the time the warnings could no longer be dismissed, it would already be too late. The Galactic Council tightened its grip. Not openly. Not violently. Control rarely needed force when procedure worked just as well. Humanity was placed under regulatory containment, a designation wrapped in neutral language and justified as a temporary measure to prevent unnecessary panic. Trade was cut. Human shipping licenses were suspended pending review. Strategic materials, reactor substrates, high-density alloys, advanced medical compounds were quietly reclassified as restricted. Dockyards delayed clearances indefinitely. Contracts were frozen mid-fulfillment. Credit networks flagged human accounts for risk assessment. Supply chains that had taken generations to stabilize began to unravel in months. Rights were revoked. Human representatives lost voting privileges in council chambers. Then speaking rights. Then access entirely. Emergency motions submitted by human delegates were denied without debate. Travel permits were restricted. Surveillance requirements were imposed for oversight. Council law, ancient, elastic, and selectively enforced, was suddenly applied with absolute precision. Every action was legal. Every justification documented. Every appeal denied. Humanity protested through the channels still available. They cited treaties signed in good faith, mutual defense agreements, shared wars, joint reconstruction efforts. Human fleets had bled alongside Council armadas. Human engineers had rebuilt worlds the Council had already written off. The Council acknowledged the filings, then archived them. Sanctions tightened further. Insurance guilds raised transit costs until civilian travel became impossible. Navigation beacons along human routes went dark for maintenance. Communication relays lagged, then failed, as service contracts quietly expired. Humanity was pushed into isolation, and the Council watched closely. They expected collapse. They had seen this outcome countless times. A species dependent on interstellar trade fractured quickly once cut off. Economies failed. Political rivalries turned violent. Colonies turned on one another as scarcity sharpened every disagreement. Refugees spilled outward, begging for reinstatement and protection. Humanity, with its arguments, its divisions, its constant dissent, should have shattered first. It didn't. Months passed. Then years. There were no refugee armadas. No mass distress calls. No desperate broadcasts pleading for mercy. Instead, human traffic rerouted inward with unsettling coordination. Peripheral colonies, once dismissed as marginal, became centers of activity. Energy output rose instead of falling. Manufacturing intensified rather than collapsed. Council analysts flagged the data as unusual. Supervisors dismissed it. They assumed humanity was burning through reserves in a final, desperate attempt to delay the inevitable. Dying civilizations often looked productive just before the end. It fit precedent. It fit expectation. Then human space went quiet. Not the chaotic silence of collapse, but something deliberate. No protests. No threats. No warnings. To the Council, that silence was confirmation. Finished. Monitoring files were closed. Observers reassigned. Humanity was quietly reclassified as non-viable, another footnote in the archive of species that had panicked too soon and paid the price. The Council moved on. They never asked why human energy output had spiked before the silence. Never questioned why industrial coordination had increased instead of degraded. Never wondered why a species supposedly facing extinction stopped asking for help altogether. They never considered the possibility that humanity had reached a conclusion of its own. That warnings ignored were lessons learned. That dependence was weakness. That survival required removing every system others could use to silence you. The Council believed isolation would punish humanity for its fear. What it actually did was remove the last reason for humanity to warn anyone ever again. Isolation didn't break humanity. It unified them. At first, there was disbelief, then anger, then a cold, steady clarity that spread faster than panic ever could. When the last Council trade lanes went dark and the final appeals disappeared into bureaucratic silence, humanity reached the same conclusion across every world it had settled. No one was coming. For centuries, humanity had carried its fractures into the stars. Old nations reborn as colonies. Corporations wielding power rivaling governments. Ideologies transplanted wholesale onto planets that had never known Earth. Those divisions endured because the galaxy allowed them to, because trade softened consequences and outside authority absorbed the cost of failure. Isolation stripped that illusion away. When shipments stopped, ideology didn't matter. When jump routes vanished, borders became irrelevant. When Council patrols ignored human distress calls, denial gave way to understanding. Division was no longer inefficient. It was fatal. Old divisions vanished, not through conquest or revolution, but necessity. Arguments that once dragged on for decades were resolved in days. Sometimes hours. Not because humanity suddenly agreed, but because survival demanded cooperation. You either worked together, or you didn't survive. Emergency coordination assemblies formed across human space. Not parliaments. not senates. Survival councils. They were led not by career politicians, but by people who understood systems, logisticians who knew how to keep supply chains alive, engineers who understood what failed first under pressure, medics who knew what shortages actually killed people. The questions were brutally simple. How do we feed everyone? How do we keep power stable? How do we make sure no colony stands alone? Corporations resisted at first. Profit collapsed without external markets. Some attempted hoarding, leveraging scarcity for control. They didn't last. Cooperative networks outpaced them within months, sharing materials, labor, and data freely, producing more with less waste. Profit was replaced with continuity. Military forces followed. Fleets that once answered to different flags began operating together out of necessity. Joint patrols became shared commands. Shared commands hardened into permanent structures. Uniforms lost insignia. Ship hulls lost ownership markings. Culture remained. Identity remained. Authority changed. All colonies stood under one command. It wasn't declared. It wasn't voted on. It emerged. Command was not a government. It did not dictate belief, language, or culture. It coordinated survival. When command issued a directive, it was followed, not out of loyalty, but because it worked. Power grids synchronized across systems. Food production stabilized despite shrinking inputs. Manufacturing standards unified so failures in one system could be repaired by another without delay. A ship built in one sector could be serviced in any other. Medical protocols standardized across worlds. Mortality rates dropped even as resources tightened. Redundancy replaced efficiency. Resilience replaced optimization. Humanity stopped functioning like competing states. They began functioning like a single organism. Education shifted almost overnight. Children learned systems thinking before history. Emergency response before politics. Every human learned something practical: fabrication, repair, medicine, logistics. Knowing how to keep something running became as fundamental as reading. This wasn't militarization. It was preparation. Because if no one else would protect them, they would protect themselves. Defense replaced borders. Early warning arrays stretched far beyond mapped space, watching vectors no council doctrine had ever considered threats. Humanity assumed betrayal as baseline. They assumed isolation would return. They assumed help would not arrive in time. So they built accordingly. The galaxy never noticed. Council observers had been reassigned. Sensor coverage reduced. Reports hinting at unusual coordination were buried under bureaucracy or dismissed as statistical noise. Humanity faded from relevance exactly as expected. And humanity did nothing to correct that assumption. They had learned the value of being underestimated. While the Council congratulated itself on silencing an inconvenient voice, human space grew quieter and stronger. Colonies once separated by light years functioned like neighboring districts. Decisions that once took generations were made in days. Not through tyranny. Through shared responsibility. Isolation had done what centuries of diplomacy never could. It removed the illusion that someone else would step in. In its place, humanity built unity not from ideology, but necessity. Not from obedience, but trust. And when the galaxy finally realized that the warnings had not stopped, only changed form, it would understand that humanity hadn't gone quiet because it was afraid. It had gone quiet because it was preparing to protect itself. In silence, humanity evolved. Cut off from the galaxy's oversight and stripped of the need to justify itself, human progress became brutally practical. There were no demonstrations meant to impress outsiders. No grand announcements. Every advancement had a single requirement. It had to work when no one came to help. New engines came first. Humanity abandoned the galaxy's dependence on sanctioned travel, hyperspace lanes, fold corridors, and jump gates regulated by those who could shut them down at will. Those systems were fast, elegant, and dangerously dependent on cooperation. Humans chose inevitability instead. They built engines that pushed directly against spacetime itself. Drives that did not shortcut reality but endured it. Slower. Heavier. Punishing on materials. inefficient by every council metric. But they could not be denied. If space existed, human ships could cross it. No lanes, no permissions, no infrastructure to sabotage. Distance became a challenge, not a barrier. Isolation became a condition, not a prison. They didn't arrive quickly. They arrived eventually. Always. Unbreakable shields followed. Not the refined energy veils favored by council fleets, designed for brief, decisive engagements, but layered systems built on redundancy without apology. Fields nested within fields. Physical mass reinforced energy dispersion. Geometry redirected force into harmless vectors. Human shields didn't try to negate attacks. They endured them. They adapted to them. They learned from them. Energy bled away. Kinetic impacts slowed, spread, and died. Each strike made the next less effective. Failure wasn't defeat, it was information. Hull plating thickened until ships resembled drifting continents. Armor wasn't decorative. It was grown, replaced, grown again. Vital systems were buried beneath layers of life support infrastructure. Farms, reservoirs, fabrication bays, medical wards. Human ships stopped being vehicles. They became habitats that moved. Fleets were built, but not for conquest. There were no banners etched into hulls. No heroic names meant to inspire fear. Ships were identified by role and redundancy, not prestige. Arc fleets protected populations. Foundry fleets produced replacements mid-transit. Defense lattices reshaped open space into controlled environments rather than battlefields. Every loss was anticipated. Every function replaceable. Every ship expendable, except the people inside. Weapons existed, of course. Humanity was not naive. But they were designed with restraint. Interdiction fields to halt advance. Area denial systems to make approach catastrophically costly. Precision null arrays to remove threats permanently, without spectacle. Humanity did not build weapons to intimidate. They built weapons to end danger. Artificial intelligence, once restricted by fear and treaty, was rebuilt under unforgiving rules. No gods. No masters. Partners only. Every system assumed error, deception, and failure as baseline conditions. Human oversight was mandatory. Human accountability absolute. Biology advanced alongside steel. Radiation tolerance increased. Cellular repair accelerated. Immune systems became adaptive networks, updating continuously. Humans didn't become visibly different. They became harder to kill. Generations grew up inside this preparation. Children learned fabrication and repair alongside language. Emergency response was basic education. Knowing how to keep something running became as fundamental as reading. This wasn't militarization. It was survival literacy. Beyond human space, the galaxy remained unaware. The Council was busy maintaining appearances, managing politics, and congratulating itself on having silenced an inconvenient voice. Data that contradicted humanity's supposed decline was filtered, reinterpreted, or quietly discarded. It was easier not to look. And so the galaxy never saw the engines that ignored borders. Never saw shields that endured forces capable of cracking moons. Never saw fleets built not to conquer, but to survive anything that came. While the galaxy looked away, humanity prepared. Not to prove a point. Not to demand recognition. But because their warnings had been ignored once. And they would never allow that mistake to cost them everything. Then a new enemy appeared. Not as a rumor. Not as a theory. As absence. The first sign wasn't an attack, it was silence. A frontier system stopped reporting on schedule. Then another. Then a third. Long-range probes sent to investigate returned nothing but distorted telemetry before vanishing entirely. The Council dismissed it as interference. Humanity did not. The next system fell in hours. Sensor ghosts captured fragments before collapsing. Fleets emerging without lanes, ships whose mass readings contradicted their size, structures that moved as if grown rather than built. Orbital stations were dismantled methodically. Moons were carved apart for raw material. Planets weren't bombarded. They were processed. The invaders identified themselves only once, in a transmission that repeated across every captured channel. The Dominion. Worlds fell. Council defense fleets mobilized according to doctrine, carefully, procedurally, far too slowly. They arrived to find debris fields where civilizations had stood. Atmospheres burned off as waste heat. Oceans boiled not as weapons, but as byproducts of extraction. The Dominion did not conquer. They harvested. Entire systems were stripped and abandoned, left silent and dead. Borders meant nothing. Treaties meant nothing. The Dominion advanced along vectors that ignored political space entirely, targeting density, infrastructure, and biological utility. Species were enslaved. Survivors were categorized, sorted, and repurposed. Engineers were implanted with control nodes and forced to maintain Dominion warforms. Soldiers were chemically altered and recycled into shock units, stripped of identity and memory. Civilian populations were reduced to labor stock, biological components feeding an expanding machine empire. Those deemed inefficient were erased. Refugees flooded into council space carrying stories too precise to deny. This wasn't rage or cruelty. It was logistics. Cold, optimized, and unstoppable. Entire cultures vanished without massacre, languages deleted, histories overwritten, species reduced to production metrics. The galaxy panicked. Emergency sessions convened in the Grand Chamber, stretching on for cycles. Representatives shouted over one another. Ancient powers argued jurisdiction. Younger species begged for protection. Military blocs refused to commit fleets without guarantees of reimbursement, territorial compensation, and command authority. The Council argued while systems burned. Votes were proposed. Votes were delayed. Votes were vetoed. Coalitions formed on paper and collapsed in practice. Fleets mobilized too slowly, bound by doctrines designed for limited wars, not extinction. Every decision required consensus, and consensus arrived only after another star went dark. When Council armadas finally engaged the Dominion, the result was annihilation. Entire fleets vanished mid-transmission. Flagships were torn apart as if dissected. The Dominion sacrificed ships freely, learning from every exchange, adapting faster than Council tacticians could respond. Weapons that had ended wars for millennia barely slowed them. Within a few short cycles, the truth became unavoidable. The Council was losing. Worse, they had no model for victory. That was when analysts noticed something deeply unsettling. On Dominion expansion maps, there was a void. A vast region of space the Dominion did not enter. Not fortified. Not contested. Simply avoided. Advance vectors curved around it. Probes altered course without explanation. Entire formations diverted as if responding to a threat no one else could see. That region aligned with archived charts. Human space. The chamber fell silent. Humanity, the species whose warnings had been dismissed as paranoia. Isolated. Sanctioned. Silenced. And yet something about them caused an empire that consumed stars to hesitate. Fear replaced denial. Dormant channels were reactivated. Deprecated frequencies restored. Messages were drafted carefully, acknowledging past misunderstandings, emphasizing shared extinction-level risk, invoking unity and cooperation. The first message went unanswered. So did the second. Worlds continued to fall. Finally, stripped of pride and ceremony, the Council broadcast a single, unfiltered transmission across every channel humanity had ever used. "We were wrong. We need your help." The reply came minutes later. Not from an ambassador. Not from a politician. From a calm, steady voice identified only as command. "We warned you," the voice said. The chamber erupted in desperate pleas. Councilors spoke at once, offering everything that had once been denied: restored rights, permanent seats, shared authority, emergency powers. The human voice did not rise. "Your dismissal did not change the threat," command continued. "It changed who would be ready when it arrived." A pause. "We have been tracking the Dominion since before your first system fell." Council displays changed. Data flooded the chamber. Dominion logistics, behavior models, structural weaknesses mapped with terrifying precision. Entire campaigns simulated. Failure points identified. Casualty projections calculated to the decimal. Humanity hadn't just been right. They had been preparing alone. "We will engage the Dominion," Command said at last. "Because extinction does not negotiate." Relief surged through the chamber. Then the voice hardened. "But understand this, you are not in command. You are observers." The transmission ended. And as Dominion fleets continued to consume the galaxy, the Council finally grasped the full cost of dismissing humanity's warning. They had ignored the only species that recognized the shape of the coming disaster. And now, survival depended on whether humanity decided the galaxy was still worth saving. The Council expected forgiveness. They believed regret could erase consequence. That an apology, delivered late but loudly, would be enough when extinction loomed close enough to taste. Humanity, they assumed, would be angry, but relieved. Ready to help. Ready to forget. They were wrong. What the Council found instead was resolve. When human channels finally reopened, the Grand Chamber filled with frantic motion. Delegates spoke over one another, offering everything that had once been denied: restored rights, permanent council seats, shared command authority, emergency powers without restriction. Promises that had taken centuries to withhold were made in minutes. Humanity listened. There was no interruption. No visible reaction. No rush. Then the reply came, calm and unmistakably final. "We will decide when to act." The words struck harder than any refusal. Council representatives protested immediately. Every moment mattered. Entire systems were burning. Species were being erased. They demanded timelines, fleet movements, confirmation that humanity would intervene before it was too late. They received none. "You asked us to trust the system," the human voice continued, identified only as command. "The system failed. We will not place survival in the hands of urgency and debate again." The transmission ended. Silence filled the chamber, thick, unfamiliar, terrifying. For the first time in galactic history, survival no longer rested on ancient authority, unanimous votes, or inherited command structures. It rested on the judgment of a species whose warnings had been dismissed, and that species was not panicking. Far beyond charted space, something began to change. In regions long labeled empty, where sensors returned only static and gravity maps dissolved into uncertainty, human constructs awakened. Installations seeded during the earliest days of isolation came online in perfect synchronization, responding to signals never broadcast across known space. Foundries ignited. Stars were tapped, not consumed, not shattered, but disciplined. Their output redirected into controlled flows of energy feeding immense frameworks wrapped in reinforced spacetime. Fleets long held in reserve aligned along vectors no council doctrine had ever charted. Soon after, space itself began to tremble. Not from hyperspace ruptures. Not from weapons fire. From strain. Across the galaxy, sensors screamed as localized distortions appeared in precise, repeating patterns light-years apart. Reality flexed, stabilized, then flexed again, like a structure being tested far beyond its intended limits. Humanity was not mobilizing. They were initializing. The Council finally understood the difference. Whatever humanity was preparing was not a reaction to the Dominion. It was not fear. It was not desperation. It was a solution conceived long before the first warning was dismissed, refined in silence, hardened by isolation, and held in reserve for the moment when failure became undeniable. The Dominion qualified. Whether the Council did, was no longer relevant. Humanity had not returned seeking forgiveness. They had not emerged to reclaim authority. They had returned because something now threatened everything, and they would act only when they were certain the outcome would be final. And as space continued to tremble, the Council realized the most terrifying truth of all. Humanity was no longer asking if they should intervene. They were deciding how completely the threat would be erased. Human fleets emerged in perfect silence. There was no warning flare, no hyperspace rupture, no detectable transition. One moment, Dominion armadas filled the void, vast, methodical formations advancing toward the last intact Council systems. The next moment, humanity was there. Space did not tear open. It yielded. Colossal human constructs unfolded along vectors the Dominion had never monitored. Arcships the size of small moons anchored the formation, their gravity wells stabilizing surrounding space. Vast lattice frameworks stretched across entire approach corridors, reshaping open void into controlled terrain. Foundry fleets aligned behind them, already fabricating replacements for losses that had not yet occurred. They were massive. They were precise. They were unstoppable. Human vessels emitted no recognizable signature. No engine flare. No weapons charging. Dominion targeting systems returned contradictory data, range without mass, mass without position, as if the human fleet existed slightly out of phase with the reality the Dominion operated in. They did not advance. They waited. Then a single message crossed every channel. Unencrypted. Unfiltered. Translated instantly into every known language. Stand down. The Dominion answered with annihilation. Entire formations surged forward, sacrificing themselves to breach the human line. Planet cracker lances fired. Reality-warping weapons detonated. Space burned white as the Dominion unleashed everything it had ever used to erase resistance. The human fleet did not move. Their shields flexed, layered systems absorbing, dispersing, and nullifying forces that had shattered stars. Energy bled away into harmless radiation. Kinetic impacts slowed, spread, and died. Human hulls did not glow. Armor did not fracture. Humanity endured. Then they responded. Not with fury. With correction. Regions of space hardened. Dominion ships slowed, then stopped entirely, trapped in volumes where physics itself refused to cooperate. Propulsion systems failed. Weapons shut down mid-cycle. Entire fleets froze mid-charge like insects suspended in amber. Human counterfire began. It was not a barrage. It was removal. Dominion vessels vanished one by one, erased by localized null events that left no debris, no explosion, only absence. Command ships disappeared first. Control nodes followed. Each strike removed something essential, unraveling the Dominion structure with surgical inevitability. The Dominion attempted to adapt. They always did. But there was nothing to adapt to. Human tactics did not escalate. They did not change. They remained constant, methodical, executing a solution calculated long before the first ship appeared. Retreat vectors collapsed before they could be used. Reinforcements never arrived. Communication across Dominion formations degraded into static, then silence. Then the Dominion's command intelligence, an entity believed to span multiple dimensions, went dark. No death cry. No final transmission. It simply stopped. The war ended before the enemy understood it had begun. Across the galaxy, Council sensors struggled to process what they were witnessing. Engagements predicted to last centuries concluded in minutes. Systems once marked for extinction went quiet, not conquered, not occupied, but spared. Human fleets did not pursue. They powered down. A final transmission followed, brief and absolute. The threat has been neutralized. Do not pursue remnants. And then humanity withdrew. Space relaxed. Physics resumed its familiar shape. Human ships vanished as cleanly as they had arrived, leaving behind stunned silence, and survivors who barely understood why they were still alive. The galaxy had expected a war. What it witnessed instead was something far more unsettling. Proof that dismissing humanity's warning had not delayed the inevitable. It had only ensured that when humanity finally acted, there would be nothing left to argue about. The Council tried to reclaim control. In the aftermath of the Dominion's erasure, emergency assemblies filled the ancient chambers once more. Borders were reaffirmed. Authority was restated. Committees formed to oversee reconstruction, defense alignment, and post-crisis governance. The language was familiar, comforting, spoken as if order had been preserved because the system had ultimately worked. It was too late. The galaxy remembered. Worlds remembered how long they burned while warnings were debated. Species remembered the silence that followed their pleas. Survivors remembered who argued, and who arrived without asking permission. The Council still possessed fleets. They still had laws. They still had history measured in millennia. But control was gone. Humanity did not step forward to rule. They refused every offer. Permanent council seats. Supreme military authority. Oversight of liberated systems. Each proposal was acknowledged, evaluated, and declined with the same calm finality. "We are not here to govern," came the final human transmission. Governance is what failed. Instead, humanity shared what it had learned. Defensive architectures designed to prevent extinction, not to project dominance. Early warning systems built to detect threats before debate had time to begin. Infrastructure designed around redundancy and resilience rather than efficiency and prestige. They helped rebuild. Then they left. Humanity did not dismantle the Council. They made it irrelevant. Across the galaxy, something irreversible shifted. Species stopped assuming someone else would protect them. Preparedness replaced ceremony. Cooperation replaced hierarchy. The belief that safety could be delegated to ancient authority began to fade. The Council still existed, but it no longer defined survival. And humanity? They faded back into the dark. Not hiding. Not isolated. Waiting. Human space remained distant and undefined, its borders unmapped, its fleets unseen. They did not occupy trade routes. They did not demand recognition. They existed beyond certainty, where sensors strained and assumptions failed. Watching. Listening. Enduring. The Council never again dismissed a human warning. They never dared. Because the galaxy now understood a truth that could not be voted away, archived, or ignored. Humanity did not need to rule to matter. They did not need permission to act. They did not need applause to protect existence. They had warned the galaxy once, and been silenced. They would not warn again. So when the stars grew quiet and the Dominion became history, one certainty spread across the galaxy, whispered between worlds and carved into every serious archive. If darkness rises again, if something ancient, merciless, or unimaginable reaches for the stars, humanity will be there. Not as rulers, not as saviors seeking gratitude, but as the ones who learned what happens when warnings are ignored and ensured it would never happen again.